Good morning, everyone. This morning we're joined by Professor Angela Stent, Professor of Government and Foreign Service and Director of our Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Professor Stent has been a member of our community for more than 4 decades, and it is such a privilege to be here with her for this conversation. So Angela, welcome. Let's get started. You're an expert in the political and economic relationships between the United States, Russia, and Europe. Can you share more about how you came to focus your scholarship in this area? What experiences led you to your passion for this subject? And were there particular moments over the course of your career that have been especially influential or meaningful to you?
Well, thank you. And I'm delighted to be speaking with you. It's a privilege for me. So when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, I was born and grew up in England, I started studying Russian history. I didn't know a word of Russian, and I became interested in it. And so after my second year in college, the college gave me a small stipend, and I took a boat from just outside London to Leningrad, and I set foot in the Soviet Union. And I spent a week there. I took a train from Leningrad to Moscow, the so-called Red Arrow, which still exists today, although it's a bit more modern. And I just got hooked on the country. And then on the way back, I then kept on the train. I went through Warsaw, through Wrocław, which was Breslau when my 2 grandmothers were born there. And then I was in Prague 2 weeks before the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And then I was in Berlin, coming into East Berlin and moving into West Berlin. And both of my parents are from Berlin. So for me, that was also quite an emotional thing to go there. But it was also looking up and seeing the snipers on the station passing from East to West Berlin. And they would have shot anyone if they thought they were trying to escape. Gave me a real sense of what was happening in Eastern Europe. So that was my first trip to the region. As I say, I got hooked. I then decided I really did want to focus and learn Russian. I came to the United States and I did a master's degree in Soviet studies at Harvard, and I learned Russian. And then I think the second most really formative and probably most of all moment was when I spent 6 months as a graduate student at Moscow State University, allegedly working on my dissertation, but since it was on a rather sensitive topic, which was relations between West Germany and the Soviet Union, I had to pretend it was something else. And at that time, my uncle was a professor of molecular biology at Berkeley, and he put me in contact with all of his colleagues in Moscow. His textbooks were used by Soviet students. And so I got to know a very interesting world of scientists, some of whom were dissidents, were against the regime. And that was a very, very formative experience. So that's really how I got committed to the subject matter. And then I had the good fortune to come to Georgetown University. It's really my first and only academic job, and to be able to teach the students about things Soviet, and to be able, obviously, to continue learning and interacting with my colleagues. In terms of moments that stand out for me personally, once I was a faculty member, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union. So very few of us thought it would happen, and we were kind of amazed when it did, and we had lots of hopes. We all had friends. I had friends from my time there as a graduate student. And so going back, the first year after it collapsed was an amazing experience. It was sort of breathing fresh air. It was talking to people who didn't feel constrained anymore to talk about what they wanted to talk about. I had a very interesting experience. I then wrote a book about German unification, and I did interview President Gorbachev. He was already out of office then. That was obviously a very interesting experience for me. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was with a group of people. We were virtually having a conference celebrating his 90th birthday, and he's someone I have a lot of respect for still because of what he allowed to happen. And then I think the other thing that's been instructive for me, really since 2004, has been I've been a member of something called the Valdai International Discussion Group. And the Russian state brings scholars of Russia to Russia every year for a conference. We meet with Russian colleagues, but we also meet with President Putin. And so that has been going on the last couple of times. Of course, it's been virtual. But to just sit there, particularly in smaller gatherings, observe him and listen to the messages that we're given, because this is a country that's difficult to understand, particularly now. It gives one greater insights into it. I did teach on a Fulbright fellowship at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which I always like to say it's sort of the equivalent of the School of Foreign Service, but it's directly under the Foreign Ministry. I taught there for a semester. That was also instructive for me because many of, or nearly all of my students, even though they're born in the waning days of the Soviet Union or after it collapsed, they were well traveled. I taught in English. None of them believed that the Soviet Union had collapsed because of its own internal difficulties. They all believed that it collapsed because the United States and its special services had forced it to collapse. And that to me was quite disconcerting. Anyway, so those are some of the things that have, I would say, have enriched my understanding of the country and have kept me interested in it.
Well, thank you. And that's a great segue to my next question, which the book Over Your Shoulder is your most recent book, Putin's World, Russia against the West and with the rest, which helped to illuminate Russia's place in this post-Cold War era. Tell us about some of the issues you explore in the book.
Sure. So there are really three questions I ask in the book. And the first one is, why were we in the West so wrong after 1991? We assumed when the Soviet Union collapsed that post-Soviet Russia would want to become integrated with the West, would want to be more like the West, even if it would have a different system. And we also assumed that if we had more trade interaction with Russia, that particularly economically, that would somehow have a beneficial effect on the political relationship. And the short answer to the question about why we were so wrong is because I think the mistake we made in the past was thinking that dealing with the Soviet Union was because it was at least nominally a communist state. And the real reason is because they're Russians. And by that, I don't mean any kind of character assassination. I mean that Russians have a very unique sense of their role in the world. They've traditionally, for hundreds of years, seen the West as an antagonist, and they have believed that they have to be able to control all the countries around them, what we would say today is the post-Soviet space, because without that, their security is really endangered. So for a number of reasons, I think we misunderstood that, and we see some of the consequences of that now. And the second question I asked is, how has Putin's Russia, with a GDP about the size of Italy's, with a declining population, with over-dependence on oil and gas revenues for its economy, how has it been able to reassert itself so successfully on the world stage, going back to areas and places from which it withdrew after the Soviet collapse? And then why, and that's in the title there, while the West has relations with Russia that have really been deteriorating, why does much of the rest of the world regard Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business? And the short answer to that question is, A, after 1991, the US and the Europeans, our allies, we all thought that Russia would want to accept the sort of rules-based international order, and we didn't have a specific plan beyond that. But Russia, and particularly when Putin came to power in 2000, did have a plan. He had a plan, and that was to restore a strong state and to make Russia a great power again. And then the second reason I think why he's been so successful is because he's taken opportunities, he's taken advantage, of opportunities presented to him by the West when we have been distracted and we haven't been focusing on it. So in my book, I describe how he's actually was a judo champion as a young man. He was the judo champion in Leningrad, and his judo skills, plus I think his training as a KGB case officer, have enabled him to really psych people out, to understand what their weaknesses are and take advantage of them. And of course, he's been in power now for 21 years and he's seen leaders come and go. And then the third question I did raise is, how could we have a more productive relationship with Russia? And of course, that's the most difficult one. And maybe that's something we'll come back to later on in our conversation.
Sure. Now, you serve as the director of our Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Tell us about some of the center's current work. What sorts of programs or initiatives are you most proud of?
Well, of course, our current work is somewhat constrained at the moment because of the pandemic. So we have a number of interesting programs at the moment. We have support from the Carnegie Corporation, and with that, we have for the past few years been conducting a series of lectures and seminars for our students and faculty with Russian colleagues. And of course, we were doing that in person. Now we're doing that remotely. But the last one was with a very interesting discussion about Russia and its neighbors. And now that we're all on Zoom, we in fact have rather large audiences, larger than they were before. That's one project. Then another part of that also is to do a series of interviews. We have attached to our center now Jill Doherty. She used to be the CNN correspondent in Moscow. She was a Centennial Fellow in the School of Foreign Service a couple of years ago. And she does so-called journalist boot camps, where she brings in Russian and then sometimes American journalists to talk about different issues. And there again, we've had a lot of student and faculty and engagement from people on the outside. We had one very interesting session with Russian and American journalists talking about responses to the Black Lives Matter protests in the US and then the protests that were going on in Russia. We've had a series of those meetings. So those are some of the things that we're doing. We also have programming on Central Asia. We just had an interesting talk actually by one of our alumna. She then got a PhD about the situation in Kazakhstan. So we try and cover sort of broad areas of the world, and we give our students the opportunity to be research fellows. If I go back a little further, I was delighted when you appointed Alexander Kwaśniewski, the former Polish president, to come to Georgetown for 3 years as a distinguished professor. And he was attached to our center. We had some very interesting meetings with him, and we still keep in touch with him. He was here for the celebration of the centenary of the School of Foreign Service. And we've had a number of, over the years, very interesting dialogues. I was thinking of one when I was preparing for this with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and her counterpart when she was Secretary of State, Igor Ivanov. And a few years ago, we gave them a platform and they had a dialogue. And I just realized it was very civil. They obviously disagreed on some things, but I realized how far down in a way we've come since then, because I couldn't imagine a conversation like that between the current Secretary of State and the current Russian Foreign Minister. So we've had over the years, I think, some very interesting dialogues. And hopefully when we're back in person, we will have more actual contact between our students and particularly the Russian students and faculty.
Sure. Now, what do you see as some of the most pressing issues, the issues you're most interested in when it comes to the current state of the relationship between the United States, Russia, and Europe?
So I think the relationship between Russia and Europe and the United States has really deteriorated. US-Russian relations are the worst they've been really since any time since before Gorbachev came to power in 1985. That has a lot to do with what happened in 2016 with the demonstrated Russian interference in the US election. We know that there was some of that last year, but it wasn't on the same scale. And so you have a situation, you have the world's two nuclear superpowers, if you're talking about the US and Russia. Between us, we have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And it's very dangerous in many ways to have a relationship that is that tense. Now, fortunately, when President Biden came in, one of the first acts his administration did was to extend this New START treaty, which President Obama had negotiated. And that regulates our nuclear arsenals, and it provides for on-site inspections. And that's extended for 5 years. But we really do need to work out a new arrangement with Russia. A lot has changed since 2011, when New START was signed. and it's just been extended exactly the same as it was before. We have a whole classes of new weapons. We have the whole issue of cyber warfare. This is something which we do need to talk to the Russians about and to try and figure out a better way of dealing with that, because as we know, we had massive cyber attack last year on solar winds and other systems in this country, which have been attributed to Russia. So I would say these are issues on which the US and Russia really do have to negotiate with each other. And a newer issue is climate change. I know that Secretary Kerry has already spoken to the Russian foreign minister, and there will be discussions on this. The Russians have very belatedly discovered climate change, but even President Putin has finally said it's a problem. So this is obviously something where we do have to work together. Russia is the largest country in the world, and the impact of climate change is very varied in Russia, but still it's of a concern to them too. And from the European point of view, their concern is obviously, as is ours, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and its repercussions for the rest of Europe. They're concerned, as are we, about the growing repression in Russia with the poisonings. Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, of course, was treated in Germany after he was poisoned. He's now in a prison camp, but concerned with the situation of human rights and democracy there, and the fact that the Putin administration is now labeling really anyone who's in opposition as a foreign agent. And that's a designation that, in the old Soviet days was there, but has never been quite that prevalent before. So these are all very important issues where we do have to talk to the Russians, but we also have to find ways of pushing back. And I think one of the positive aspects of the Biden administration is also that it's really trying to work with the Europeans. I believe Secretary Blinken is on his way to Europe now, trying to work with the Europeans so that we can have a more united policy in dealing with Russia.
Now, in addition to your scholarship and your teaching, you've also served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia in Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, as well as in the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department. How have these roles informed your scholarship and your teaching?
I think both of those roles have been very important for me in understanding, since what I write about, the books I write about really are sort of policy-oriented books. In other words, they talk about policy, they're not that theoretical. So working in the State Department, which I did at the end of the Clinton administration and the beginning of the Bush administration, I was hired as an expert as opposed to a political appointee. It gave me, of course, a much better sense about how policy is made. It also taught me as an academic how to write a one-page memo, which is the opposite of what you normally do as an academic. And I think the other interesting thing is it taught me teamwork in a way that maybe academia doesn't quite focus on so much. And you also, when you work in the government, you have to lose all your sense of ego because nothing that you write is ever published under your name. So that's one side of it. But I think just grappling with the different issues and understanding how complicated it is when decisions have to be made. And as National Intelligence Officer, I think what was heartening to me about that is that the issues we discussed there, and we were obviously, again, thinking sort of longer term, were already the same issues that academics discuss. It's just you have different sources of information. But again, the teamwork, thinking about how you can convey something to a policymaker who doesn't have that much time to read anything, how you can convey it clearly and show them what possible options are, that I think was very instructive too. So I found both of those experiences enriched my understanding of the subject matter, and I think also enriched my teaching because I could approach what I teach with a somewhat broader view than if I'd never been able to work in the government.
Oh, thank you. And I'm grateful to you for taking this time for this conversation. As we close, is there a message you'd like to share with our community?
Well, I think Georgetown is a great place if you're interested in Russia or Eurasia or Eastern Europe. And I want to encourage people to study, to go into that field. We have a sort of shrinking generation of people who are trained in this field also actually in these nuclear issues too. So you should do it. You should persevere. There are lots of opportunities. And again, Georgetown University is a very good place to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Angela, thank you for sharing your reflections with us today and for all that you mean to our community over the course of these many, many years. We're so grateful for your leadership and your service. It's been a real pleasure to have this time together with you.
Thank you. Enjoyed the conversation a lot.
I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.